Most of you know we have already started this typed outline, which is a continuation of Roman numeral 5 on the Reformation in England. So I just wanted you to know that by the time you're watching this recording, we are going to be on number 5. Okay, so if you're keeping up with this, that is where you should be starting this new recording and taking notes using the rest of this outline. Before we move on to more information, of course, about Henry VIII, I want to make sure that I've made something very clear. When you are asked about the Reformation starting in England and who was responsible and what was specifically done, your answer is, of course, Henry VIII forming the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England. So when he broke from the Catholic Church and created the Anglican Church, and with him as the head of the church, with the act of supremacy allowing for this, that is the start of the Reformation in England, okay? And yes, all of that stemmed from the fact that he couldn't have a son with Catherine and was desperate for a divorce. So this is the action that he took in order to get a son eventually, which more to that coming very soon. So now you know how the Reformation got its start in England. And remember, if you're looking at chronology, this is after it had already gotten underway in the German states. Martin Luther's already done his thing. You know that because we talked about the defender of the faith. The title, Defender of the Faith, with the defense of 7 sacraments. Okay, so moving on. In total, Henry had 6 wives during his rule as King of England. Remember Anne Boleyn? So remember I told you she was 6 months pregnant. They went ahead and got married, and she gave birth to a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Now, a girl was very disappointing to Henry, but he was hopeful because Anne got pregnant again very quickly. However, 6 months into this second pregnancy of Anne's, she does something extremely foolish. She went horseback riding. Y'all, she's 6 months pregnant and she goes horseback riding. And yes, there's an accident. She falls off the horse and she goes into premature labor. And y'all, once a woman goes in labor, there's no turning back. That baby's coming out. Well, everyone was gathered to, of course, hear the news of the birth of this second child for Henry VIII. Unfortunately, it was a silent birth, which means stillborn. Baby was dead on arrival. And worse, it was a male. Yes, this would have been Henry's son. And you can imagine how infuriated he was. Because in his mind, Anne killed the future King of England, and now she must die. So she did. She was executed shortly after this stillborn birth. While awaiting for execution, they had her in the Tower of London, which is infamous for its prisoners in England. And she actually had a last request before her execution. Since she was raised in France, I probably didn't tell you all that, but yes, she was French. They used swords in France to execute their subjects. England used an axe, which is a little bit more dull and probably more painful. Swords definitely, could get the job done a lot faster. So she asked if the executioner could use a sword. Believe it or not, Henry agreed. He allowed her to have the sword behead her. So now Henry is back to square one. He has no wife and he has 2 daughters, which are of little use to him because he needs a son as the heir to the throne when he dies. Well, he's 45 years old by now, and he is going to get married to Jane Seymour. And lo and behold, she gets pregnant 9 months later. Everyone's gathered around, and yes, it's finally a boy. and Henry is thrilled that he finally has an heir to the throne. But Jane doesn't make it. She died due to complications of the childbirth. And Henry is absolutely, beside himself because he finally had someone that gave him a son. And for all he knew, she could have given him more. Because what happens is this son, who they name Edward, who will one day be Edward VI, King of England, he is very sickly and he may not live long. So Henry realizes he does need to find another wife very quickly and have another son just in case something happens to Edward. So are you ready for the rest of the soap opera? Remember, all this stuff that I'm saying right now, past Edward, you do not have to write it down. It just makes it for an interesting story. Well, Henry's friend, Thomas Cromwell, sets the king up with a German girl. And this is someone the king has never seen before, but he trusts Cromwell's judgment. Well, the day has arrived for the German girl to come and meet her future husband, the King of England. And Henry goes out to meet her, and when he lays eyes on her for the first time, he is not pleased. In fact, he basically would look at her and say, "You repulse me." That's how unattractive she was. So, in the king's eyes, he blames Cromwell. Because he is her name is Anne of Cleves, and he had already made a promise to her before he had even laid eyes on her that he was going to get married. So he kept that promise, but he's furious with Cromwell, and he has him beheaded for lousy matchmaking. And then shortly after the Anne of Cleves marriage, he has it annulled, and he is now in search of wife number 5. Well, keep in mind, Henry's getting up in age. He's 50 years old. He's got a 54-inch waist, and he weighs over 300 pounds. He has a terrible temper, and he loves to throw things. He also has this wound that has ulcerated on his leg, which means fluids coming out. So it's got a terrible smell, and people would just have to hold their breath when they're around him because it smelled so horrible. Well, his next choice for a wife is a 22-year-old by the name of Catherine Howard. Why in the world would she marry this 50-year-old, over 300-pound man who has this horrible smell coming off of him? To be the Queen of England, of course. That's why. But poor Henry, because when they get married, Catherine could not shake off her old boyfriend, who was named Thomas Culpeper. And shortly after the marriage, Catherine decided to go and visit Thomas. Well, little did she know that she was followed by some of the king's men. He was a little suspicious of some things about her, so he had her followed. And after being in Thomas's house for quite a while, the king's men bust in the door and they find them playing Naked Twister. No, not really. But y'all can figure out what they were doing. You get the point. Catherine's caught with her skirt down, and Henry goes ballistic. So the two of them are going to, of course, be arrested, thrown into the Tower of London, where they await for execution. Well, Thomas will go first. And after he was beheaded, the guards went to Catherine's cell with Thomas's headless body to show her. And yes, that definitely freaked her out. She did not go down with dignity like Anne Boleyn did. Anne kept her composure, and she lay down, and that executioner, took her head off with a sword. Well, not Catherine. Um, she will have to get roughed up a bit to get her on the chopping block. And guess what her last words were? You won't believe this. She said, "I die the wife of the king, but I would rather die the wife of Thomas Culpeper." Ooh, what a slap in the face to the King of England for her to say those things right before her head is cut off. So of the 6 wives Henry had, 2 got beheaded, Anne Boleyn and now Catherine Howard. Well, Henry's single again, but he does marry that 6th and final wife. It's another Catherine. He just has this thing with Catherines. Her name's Catherine Parr, and she will actually be the only wife to outlive Henry. So there you have it, the wives of Henry VIII, and thus ends that soap opera. So moving on to your outline on number 6. The Statute of the 6 Articles. This is basically saying that the Anglican Church maintained most of the Catholic doctrines. So that means the Anglican Church will follow the Catholic beliefs, but instead of having the Pope as the head of the church, it will be the king. So that once again just shows you how Catholic in his heart Henry VIII really is. He's going to set up this Anglican church to look like a Catholic church. The services are conducted just like a Catholic mass, but the only difference is he is the head of the church, not the Pope. So I hope I made that clear for y'all. And with this Statute of the 6 Articles, he's saying we are Catholic in all ways, except there is no Pope. So now let's take a look at the next King of England, which is Henry VIII's only son, Edward. So Henry VIII dies, just, older age, getting ill. And Edward, his only son, will be crowned Edward VI. He is 10 years old when he receives this title and becomes the king. Now, strong Protestants will rule on his behalf. Since Edward is so young, he is going to be greatly influenced by some Protestants. So under Edward's rule, England will move towards Protestantism by adopting Calvinism. So these are the new practices. The clergy could marry. Remember, Catholics don't believe that the clergyman can get married. The iconic images that were in the Anglican Church are now being removed. Okay, again, that just is too similar to what the Catholics were doing, statues and things like that. Communion by the laity was expanded, which means churchgoers, people that don't take vows but are within the church. They are able to take communion instead of it only being the church leaders who had taken vows. So it is expanded to include more people. One thing you want to add that's not on this slide is where it mentions about him adopting Calvinism. Make sure you add that Edward was under the influence of Archbishop Cranmer. So Archbishop Cranmer was influencing a lot of these decisions by Edward. Under Edward VI, the new doctrine for the Anglican Church was very similar to Luther. And I just listed these examples, but you don't have to write them down. But it just shows you how similar the doctrine was to Luther's beliefs. Now, unfortunately, Edward died a premature death. Remember, I told you he was very sick when he was born, so he did have some health issues. This led to a religious struggle between Protestants and Catholics. I'm going to go ahead and end this video so that we can go over the next ruler of England in the next video.